Well, another Monday is here, and I got a good story for you today. This one here was a real meat grinder on several levels, and I'll jump right into this thing. It was actually a 1999 Olds Alero, and this thing, uh, they started noticing a rattling noise coming from the engine area, and it wasn't always there. When it did happen, it was always on deceleration, but the transmission didn't have to be in gear for it to make this noise. Now, the local GM service outlet, which was a small dealership, thought they had pinpointed the problem as a loose brick in the catalytic converter. And so they replaced the catalytic converter with an aftermarket part to keep the cost low. In other words, that's the one that you just cut out the other converter and put the new one in there. And the car seemed like it was fine for a week or two, but then the sound came back. So another trip to the dealer didn't really yield anything. The dealer said basically they didn't want to fool with it, and the owners were shown the door. They weren't ugly, but they just said, we don't want to work on this anymore, and we really don't know what's wrong with it. And that was kind of puzzling, because usually, you know, if the people are willing to pay, and these people were really willing to pay, and they were nice people, they weren't hard to get along with because I knew them well. Anyway, this thing wasn't smoking, and it hadn't overheated, and it ran good. It seemed feasible to attempt some kind of a repair. But one possibility was the service department had been burned on one of these before with a similar problem and didn't want to go there again. But you just really can't tell. 126,000 miles on the clock is what it had. And then, of course, I made a little graphic of that aftermarket. We've used those aftermarket catalytic converters. If you use a Walker aftermarket catalytic converter, you will not have issues with a downstream oxygen sensor check engine light. I have actually seen when I was at the Ford dealer, people would have a muffler shop put a cheap aftermarket catalyst on there, and it would still throw a code, and you'd have to actually put a better one on there than that. But usually, if you go with a Walker, then you're typically pretty safe. Now, that's not all knocking noises mean there's something loose, right? I lived in Texas. I helped this roommate build his VW engine on his rail buggy. And my dad had worked on VW bugs for 30 years, and I had built some bug engines, but it had been a long time. By the time I was working in Texas, I was doing all this American car work, you know. And so, but we had disassembled this rail buggy engine of his, and we had really carefully, using all the procedures that I had learned from my dad, I built this thing. And, you know, rebuilding anybody that's rebuilt a bug engine will tell you, it's not like building any other engine. You get brand new pistons and cylinders. Now, sometimes if the magnesium engine case is, you know, it splits in half, and there's where you get your crankshaft. It's a strange thing. If you had never done a bug, just look at the way they're put together. They're not like much of anything else. But anyway, the mistake that I made, you notice, I was so used to pointing the arrows on the pistons toward the engine, into the engine that had the belts, which is the back end of the bug engine, because it's in the back of the car. I called my dad because this thing, after we built it, it cranked up, it ran great, but it started knocking. And it not only did it start knocking, what was really strange was it would snatch the front wheels off the ground. I mean, like you wouldn't believe it, had tremendous amounts of power, more than I ever expected it to have. But I called my dad and I said, this thing's knocking, and I think I put it together right. He said, the arrows on the top of the pistons, which way did you point those? I said, well, I pointed them toward oh no, they got to be pointed toward the flywheel, which is what I'm showing you here. And I says, and I put the doggone things pointing the other way. And so the piston's slightly offset, is what it amounts to. And so the whole problem was, with that knocking, was that I had put the pistons in there backwards. And it's really more important than it would seem. You know, if you just look at a piston, you think, what difference does it make? But that's not the way it is. I mean, you could go into a long diatribe about that. But after we put it back together right, it ran really quiet, but it didn't have as much power. And my dad said, you can build one of those with the pistons in there backwards, and you can race one that has the pistons in there the right way, and if they're both spec'd out the same way, the one with the pistons in there backward will outrun the stew out of the one. But if you can put up with that knocking, but I think it would eventually come apart. We didn't see any damage to the pistons because we didn't drive it very much, but anyway, I thought that was very interesting. All right, so this quad 4 was what was in this Alero, and there's 2 chains in this particular engine. There's a regular timing chain, which is in the front, and then there's a balance chain on the balancer, and it comes off of a gear that's on the crankshaft, and on one end of the crankshaft. And revving the engine and allowing it to return to idle would produce a second order rattling that it didn't line up with the speed of the crankshaft. It was like you were hearing 2 taps for every speed of the crankshaft, like that. And I couldn't hear the noise anywhere with a stethoscope probe touching anything. But when I screwed the end off and used it for a listening pipe, which I like to do that too, it was really, really loud in the oil pan area. But if I touched the oil pan, I couldn't hear it at all with the stethoscope on my ears. But when I held that listening pipe up there, I could hear it. And so here I was looking at a situation like that, and it turned out I actually called this guy that I knew that was a go-to guy at a GM dealership, big GM dealership in another town, and I said, what do you think about this? This is a strange noise, and it kind of sounds like a chain. And he says, well, I'll tell you this. He said, we've had some of those, and what we did to fix the ones that we had after we fought with them a while was we replaced the balance unit. They call it the balance shaft, which is weird because it's got 2 shafts in it, as you can see here. And they're actually, this is driven by that gear, and one shaft drives the other one, and they're weighted. You know, they actually have to be timed with each other, and then when you put it together, they got to be timed to the engine and all that. More about that later. That's an interesting piece of hardware. This thing includes the oil pump. The oil pump's in there because you see the screen here. And it cost about $400 back then to get a new one. And so the customers were really easy to get along with. And I said, look, what I'm getting from this guy that I know at the GM dealer, you know, I'm not too proud to ask for, advice in a situation like this. I said, this is going to cost $400. And, pretty doggone expensive. But that's what we're looking at. And so they said, well, go ahead and do it. Well, the engines, the 4-cylinder engines, like to jump up and down. And that's why so many of them have balance shafts in them. There's a lot of them that don't. And these Ford Contours came out without a balance shaft in them. I don't know why the older Fords did just fine without a balance shaft, but these Contours, they would jiggle and shake everything. And there was a TSB that I'm showing you right here that was talking about remove the steering wheel, mass damper, airbag module, radiator mounts, and replace them with revised parts. They were having you replace all kinds of stuff to try to fix this because they didn't want to have to go in there and put a balance right. And look, it said, look at what it says here. The procedure contained in this TSB article may not completely eliminate all vibration from the vehicle. They were basically saying you can do all this work, but they made us have to put up with it because you could just feel a little bit of quiver, whenever it was sitting there idling. And there was quite a few of those that came in there complaining about that. Now there was one time, I mentioned this before I think, there was a S10 Chevy pickup came in with one of them 4.3 engines in it, and you would have sworn that thing had an engine skip because of the way it felt. I mean, but the engine was jiggling like it had an engine skip, but you could go to the exhaust pipe, put your hand back there, and it was like, and if it's skipping, anybody knows it'll go pop, 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 pop. It wasn't doing that. And so when I said, well, that's not an engine skip, that's some kind of a cyclical vibration that's being carried into and everybody could feel it, and they didn't like it. The guy didn't like it, and so I called the same Chevrolet place, talked to the shop foreman that time, and I said, Ted, what is the deal on this here? He says, you'll never fix that. See, I was at the Ford dealer, and he was at the Chevy dealer. He said, the only way we've been able to make that a little bit better is you can get a Caprice transmission mount and put on that thing, and it will make it feel a little bit better, but you will never fix that vibration on that truck. You're going to always be stuck with it. And I was thinking, goodness gracious. And it must be something that happens after they get older. One way or another, the people at that great big Chevrolet dealer, and it was a huge Chevy dealer, had never been able to figure out what to do to fix it. Some other Chevy dealers might have been able to. I don't know, because everybody's got different experience and all that. Well, this is a $400 part, and this is how it mounts on there. It's on the bottom. This is what it looks like underneath there. And so here you've got these two flats right here. I'll talk about those again in a minute. But it's the chain that drives it is on this end over here, on the end of the crank, on the opposite end from the harmonic balancer and all. And this makes it run really, really smooth. And so, but there was no visible signature marks, on the chain or the timing chain or anything else. We basically looked at everything to see if there was the chain had been slapping the covers, or because it kind of sounded like a chain noise anyway. And so we went ahead and put the balancer on there. But pulling the oil pan on this one means you've got to pull this pipe. It goes underneath the pan and it gets the thermostat out of there and all that, and it's bolted. There's a little ear that is bolted to under here. And so once you get that one, you can pull the pan off fairly easy once you get this silly water pipe out from under it. And all right, now we had to time the balance unit. We put it on there. We had to time that thing. This is the special tool. See, this is it without the special tool. You might also notice that in this drawing, and I got this from GM, except GM has it mounted on an engine stand the other way, and I inverted it so it would look like it looks in the car, because you can replace this thing in the car once you pull the pan off. But you notice they got this tool drawn backwards with this thing here sticking out. But see, it's obviously supposed to go in there, and so that this lines up with that bolt hole, and it holds those shafts. So you replace number one cylinder at top dead center, rotate the crank 90 degrees in either direction, it doesn't matter which way, and place the ballast shaft flats as shown, and then you put your tool on there. When you put that tool on there, that holds those exactly where they're supposed to be while you put the chain on. And the chain comes next. All right, now remember, if you ever have to do one of these, this bolt has left-hand thread. They don't want it screwing itself out of there apparently, so they made it left-hand thread. If you didn't know that, you'd bust it off. So make sure you're aware of that, because see, this is the crank gear, and this is spinning the balancer. You might notice this gear is twice the size of that one too. And so there's no timing marks of any kind. You're going to locate this, and this is the way it is with a lot of shafts, camshafts, crankshafts, all kinds of stuff in a lot of your new engines. You're going to have little pins or whatever to locate the shafts where they're supposed to be, and then the gears aren't keyed or anything. You just put them on there good and tight. And this one here, you were supposed to get a brass 40 thousandths feeler gauge. This tensioner's got a slot. See that slot right there? And you're basically supposed to loosen that up and put a brass 40 thousandths feeler gauge right in there. And then you were supposed to pull that up so that, it was good and snug. You couldn't use a steel one because it's too stiff. And so once you got that, you pull your brass feeler gauge out of there. And I'm talking about you had to put it in there just like you see right here. The only problem is, I looked, and there may be one out there somewhere now, but I looked high and low, and I could not find a 40 thousandths brass feeler gauge. I could find a 30. In one place I found a 35, but I said, this is kind of ridiculous. And so what I went ahead and did was I was even going to get some brass shim stock, but there wasn't any like that either. But I used a piece of a plastic from a hand cleaner jug. I cut that out and I measured it, and it was 40 thousandths of an inch thick. And I stuck it up in between there, and I tightened that, chain tensioner, because it's going to make noise if the engine's not right, and that's the important thing. And so I got that done, and we put that thing back together, and it lasted for about 3 months, and then it started making racket again. And I said, doggone it, what is this, because we thought we were done with it. And I'm telling you, they drove it for a long time, and she kept giving me good reports on it because I knew her really well. Her and her husband brought it over there, and she was the one that drove the car. So the timing chain, it turned out, was making the noise the next time it came. And what we found was this tensioner was sticking. It's supposed to go in and out real smooth. A new one will. and it has a little ratchet mechanism where they're supposed to hold it when you're putting it up in there, and then you release that, and you can't see that from the way I got it. It's C manual to reset and all that kind of stuff. But the long and the short of it is, when I would push this thing in with my thumb, it would stick right there, and when I let go of it, it would stay there. And so this thing just was not working right. Now, this one here, this was a sort of a wacky situation that I didn't appreciate, because it made us look silly. We had to put up a $400 part on there, and now it's making noise again. But they were really nice. These were some of the nicest people ever, and they were, they believed what I told them. I wasn't lying to them about anything, and I knew that we had made a difference when we put that balancer on there. So we went ahead, and that little two-stage oil piston thing was sticking. This is the new one we put on there. This is not a really good picture, but it was the best one I had. The noise was gone after we put that new tensioner on there. I heard about one old guy that would put a different type tensioner on there that had a ratchet that would hold it in place and it wouldn't let it retract, once it was out to a certain place, just to fight, to deal with this kind of noise so it wouldn't come back. All right, so everything was fine. It worked really well again. They drove it for another 2 months. And then lo and behold, they came back with another noise that was slightly different, had different properties, and we could hear this one really loud in the flywheel area. And this one, basically, we had to put a flywheel in to stop that noise. After that, there was no more noise ever. But we did a lot of work, and they spent a lot of money. Interesting thing about this flywheel, if you want to look at it, this flywheel only has 3 torque converter bolts. Isn't that interesting? You don't hardly ever see that. Usually you'll see 4, or you'll see, sometimes you'll see 6. But on this particular one, there's only 3. And that just always interested me whenever they did something like that. All right. Now this is the guy that did the work, and this was him standing there after the work was done, posing next to the car, because he was really proud of having got all that done. This guy had a lot of grit, a lot of determination. He never complained about anything. He was a military veteran, and he was just really good. He was a good student. He really was. And he worked at a Ford dealer somewhere down in Florida after he graduated from my program. But anyway, that's the story of the Alero. It's a short video, but I did want to share that and give you some pointers on that. And there's other noise stuff I could talk about, but I'll do that on another video. So I hope you guys have a good week, and I thank you for tuning in, and leave me some comments or like, subscribe, share this video with some other people, and I'll see you next time.